The rain had been falling since dawn, soaking the small Alabama town in a grey, unshakable gloom. Black umbrellas bloomed in the cemetery like sombre flowers, their edges trembling under the weight of the weather. Margaret Ellis stood at the edge of the grave, her gloved hands clasped tightly around a damp handkerchief, staring at the closed mahogany casket that held, so she believed, the remains of her husband, Thomas Ellis. She had not seen his body. They told her the impact of the car accident had been too violent, that it was better this way. She nodded at the time, unable to bear the thought of seeing him broken. But now, as she looked at that sealed box, a bitter ache rose in her throat. She wanted, desperately, one last glimpse. The pastor's voice droned on, words about eternal life and heavenly rest. Margaret barely heard him. Her mind kept circling back to the phone call she'd received just 2 days before the accident, Thomas telling her he'd be late getting home from a business trip. His voice had sounded warm, steady, exactly like the man she had loved for 32 years. And now, that voice was gone. Neighbors stood close, whispering condolences. Mrs. Parker, her next-door neighbor for 20 years, leaned in. "He was a good man, Margaret. This town will miss him." Margaret managed a nod. Her voice cracked when she answered, I don't know how I'm supposed to live without him." The pastor invited her forward to place a white rose on the casket. Her legs felt heavy, each step pulling her deeper into the reality she'd been trying to resist. She set the rose gently atop the polished wood, raindrops scattering over the surface like tiny, cold tears. Thomas had been more than just her husband. He was her anchor, the man who read her moods with a glance, who could coax a smile from her even on the hardest days. They had met at a church picnic in 1987, his easy charm and laugh cutting through the awkward shyness she carried. He had courted her with slow dances and long drives on summer nights, and when he asked her to marry him under the big oak by the river, she'd said yes without hesitation. The years since had been filled with the ordinary beauty of shared life, Sunday breakfasts in their sunlit kitchen, late-night conversations about dreams they'd chase someday, the comfort of knowing his hand would always reach for hers under the covers. And now, gone, torn away in a matter of seconds on a wet stretch of highway. A gust of wind rattled the tree branches overhead. Margaret's black hat brim dripped water onto her cheeks, mingling with the tears she no longer tried to hide. She could hear the funeral director murmuring instructions, the scrape of the lowering device as the casket began its descent. The hollow thud of dirt striking would made her flinch. Each sound was another reminder. This is real. This is final. Linda, her oldest friend, slipped an arm around her shoulders. "Come on, honey," Linda whispered. "Let's get you home." But Margaret lingered a moment longer, rooted to the spot. She closed her eyes and pictured Thomas in their living room, sprawled on the couch with a newspaper, glancing up to flash that half-smile that always undid her. She wanted to freeze that image forever. Finally, she let Linda guide her toward the car. The ride back was silent except for the rain ticking against the windows. Margaret stared out at the blurred shapes of houses and storefronts, each one holding a memory of Thomas, buying her ice cream on Main Street, fixing the porch swing, waving to the mailman. When they pulled into her driveway, the house loomed like a dark, hollow shell. She stepped inside, greeted by the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the air. Everything was exactly as he had left it. His coffee mug by the sink, his reading glasses on the end table, his jacket hanging on the coat rack. She walked slowly to the bedroom. The bed was neatly made, the side he'd slept on still dented from the last morning they woke up together. On the dresser sat the photo from their 25th anniversary trip to Charleston, both of them laughing, arms wrapped around each other. Margaret reached into the closet and pulled out his favorite shirt, a soft flannel worn thin at the elbows. She pressed it to her face, breathing in the trace of him that remained. Her voice trembled as she whispered into the empty room, "I'll keep my promise. I'll love you until my last breath. Outside, the rain continued its relentless tapping on the roof, a steady, mournful rhythm. Inside, Margaret sank into the chair by the window, the flannel shirt clutched in her lap, and let the grief wash over her in slow, aching waves, never imagining that the man she mourned might not be lying in the ground at all. The years after Thomas's funeral slid by with a strange, heavy sameness. Seasons changed outside the windows of the Ellis home, but inside, time barely moved. Margaret kept the house exactly as it had been on the day he died. His jacket still hung by the front door. His coffee mug sat on the kitchen counter, untouched but clean, as if waiting for the morning he might stroll in and fill it again. She rose each day at the same hour, brewed 1 cup of coffee, and sat at the kitchen table staring at the empty chair across from her. Sometimes she spoke aloud, as if Thomas was still there. "It's supposed to be sunny today. You would have liked that." Friends tried to pull her back into the rhythms of the living. Linda, steadfast and patient, visited every week with fresh flowers or a pie from the diner. "Margaret, it's been 5 years," Linda would say gently. "I know you loved him, but you can't stay in the past forever." Margaret would only shake her head. "I'm not in the past, Linda. I'm just not ready for the future." Church felt different without Thomas by her side. She still sat in the same pew they had shared for decades, but every hymn seemed to carry an echo of his voice. Sunday afternoons she'd walk alone through the park where they used to watch children feed ducks at the pond. Now she barely noticed the laughter of others. It was a sound she had learned to let pass her by. A few times odd things happened, things she brushed aside. A letter arrived addressed to Mr. Thomas Ellis from a post office box in another state. She assumed it was a billing error. Once, a credit card statement came showing charges in Florida, though Thomas had never been there. She called the bank to close the account, telling herself it was just fraud. Her family worried. Her sister, Elaine, urged her to sell the house and move closer to her. "You need people around you, Margie. This place is too quiet, too full of ghosts." But Margaret refused. The quiet was the only thing she could control, and the ghosts, she wasn't ready to let them go. At night, she often sat in the living room with a single lamp on, flipping through photo albums. Their wedding day, his arm around her in front of the oak tree where he'd proposed. Birthdays, holidays, trips to the coast. She'd trace his face with her fingertip, remembering the exact shade of his eyes, the way his smile curved more on one side. One spring evening, as the sun dipped low, she found herself standing in the doorway of his study. Everything inside was exactly as he had left it. His desk neat, his pens lined up, a half-finished crossword puzzle beside a leather-bound notebook. She almost stepped in, but something about crossing that threshold felt like trespassing into a room that still belonged to him. She closed the door quietly, as if not to disturb him. Her life had shrunk to a narrow path. The house, the grocery store, church, Linda's kitchen table. People in town still spoke of her as poor Margaret, the faithful widow. It was a title she wore like a second skin. And then, on a late summer night heavy with the smell of rain, the phone rang. The clock read 10:42 p.m., too late for polite calls. She considered letting the machine pick up, but something in her gut told her to answer. "Mrs. Ellis?" The voice on the other end was a woman's, steady but unfamiliar. "Yes, this is she." There was a pause, as if the caller was gathering herself. You don't know me, but I believe we share something in common." Margaret's brow furrowed. "And what would that be?" "We were both married to a man named Thomas Ellis." The words hit like a crack of lightning in the dark. Margaret's first reaction was disbelief, maybe even anger. "I'm sorry, but my husband died 5 years ago." "Mine died 10 years ago," the woman said quietly. "And I buried him." Margaret gripped the phone tighter. The living room seemed to tilt. She wanted to hang up, to laugh it off, to demand proof, but her voice caught. "That's impossible." "I wish it were," the woman replied, "because I don't think we're the only ones." The line went quiet for a heartbeat too long, the rain beginning to tap against the windows. Margaret could hear her own pulse in her ears. She didn't know it yet, but that call was the first crack in the coffin she had sealed in her heart, one that, piece by piece, was about to be pried wide open. Margaret sat frozen in her armchair, the phone pressed to her ear. She could hear the rain outside, steady and relentless, but the stranger's words were louder in her head. "We were both married to a man named Thomas Ellis." Who are you?" Margaret asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "My name is Helen Granger," the woman said. "I live in South Carolina now. But years ago, I was Helen Ellis." Margaret felt her chest tighten. "That's not possible. I've been Mrs. Thomas Ellis for 32 years. I buried him 5 years ago." "I buried him 10 years ago," Helen said, her tone flat, like someone delivering a sentence she'd practiced over and over. "I have a death certificate. I have photographs from the funeral. I stood where you're standing now, next to a coffin with his name on it." Margaret's mind scrambled for an explanation. Maybe this was a mistake, a cruel prank. She gripped the phone tighter. "If this is some kind of sick joke." "It's not a joke." Helen cut her off, her voice low but urgent. "And I don't think it's just you and me. I believe there are more. Other women. Other widows." Margaret let out a humorless laugh, the sound brittle. "Do you realize what you're saying? That my husband faked his death. Twice. That he somehow lived 2 separate lives." "More than 2, Helen replied. "And if you don't believe me, I can prove it." Margaret's eyes darted around the room, as if the walls themselves might collapse under the weight of the words. "Prove it, then." "I have documents, Margaret. Marriage certificates. Death certificates. Photos. I can send them to you. But I think we should meet in person. There are things I can't explain over the phone." Margaret hesitated. Meeting meant admitting there might be truth to this madness. "Why now? Why call me after all these years?" Helen's voice cracked for the first time. "Because last week I saw him." Margaret's breath caught. "Saw who?" "Thomas, or whatever his real name is. Alive. Walking down the street in Charleston like nothing had ever happened." The line went silent. Margaret's pulse thundered in her ears. She wanted to slam the phone down, to erase the call from existence, but something in Helen's voice rang with an unsettling sincerity. "Send me what you have," Margaret finally said, her voice thin. "If you're lying, I'll know." "I'll send it tomorrow," Helen said. "And Margaret, I'm sorry. I know what this feels like." When the call ended, Margaret sat in the dim light for a long while, the cordless phone resting heavy in her lap. The rain blurred the view outside, turning the streetlights into hazy orbs. She felt like she was watching the world through a veil, everything familiar, yet not quite real. She rose and went to the mantel, where a framed photo of her and Thomas smiled back at her. His arm was slung around her shoulders, his eyes warm and steady. She had trusted those eyes. Now, doubt seeped into every memory. By the next afternoon, a thick manila envelope arrived in her mailbox, the return address scrawled in a neat but hurried hand, Helen Granger. Margaret carried it to the kitchen table, her fingers trembling as she slid a knife through the seal. Inside were photocopies of a marriage certificate dated 1995, listing Helen as the bride and Thomas Ellis as the groom. The signature was his. She would have known it anywhere. There was also a death certificate from 2008, cause of death, automobile collision, and then a photo, grainy but clear enough to make her stomach flip, of Thomas standing on a sunny sidewalk, alive, his hair grayer but unmistakable. Margaret gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. Her mind replayed the funeral, the closed casket, the pastor's solemn words. She had never asked to see the body. She had trusted the explanation. She called Helen that evening. "I got the envelope," she said quietly. "And now you believe me." Margaret didn't answer. Instead she asked, "How many?" Helen's sigh was heavy. "I know of 4, including you and me. There may be more. 4 women who all buried the same man," Margaret said, the words tasting bitter. "Yes. And every time there was a life insurance payout. Not huge sums, but enough to start over somewhere else. New name, new wife, new story." Margaret pressed her fingers to her temples. "Do the other women know?" "One does. Claire, from Florida. She was the first I found. The other, June, in Texas. She's in denial. She thinks I'm some scam artist." Margaret leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. "Why would he do this? We had a good life. We weren't rich, but we were happy." "You thought you were happy," Helen said gently. "I thought I was too." "He's good at that, making you feel like the center of his world. Until he vanishes." Silence stretched between them, the kind that comes when 2 people are staring at the same ugly truth. Finally, Helen said, "We need to meet. All of us. If we're going to understand who this man really is, we have to share what we know." Margaret looked at the photo on the table, her husband's familiar smile now a mask she no longer recognized. She thought of the vows they had exchanged, the promises she had clung to for 32 years. "All right," she said, her voice hardening. "Let's find out who I've been mourning all this time." The morning after her call with Helen, Margaret woke before sunrise. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the edges of her mind sharp with restless thoughts. Every memory of Thomas now felt like it had a hairline crack running through it, small, but deep enough to weaken everything it touched. She decided she wasn't going to wait for answers to come to her. She would find them herself. Margaret started in the most logical place, the cedar chest at the foot of her bed. Inside were the pieces of their shared life, letters tied in ribbon, ticket stubs from vacations, the worn leather wallet he'd carried for years. She spread them across the bed, scanning for anything that felt out of place. It didn't take long. Among the bank statements and insurance papers was a set of receipts from a hardware store in Baton Rouge, dated 3 months before the accident. Thomas had told her he was on a sales trip in North Carolina at the time. She set those aside, her pulse quickening. Next, she pulled the folder containing his death certificate and related documents. The signature of the attending physician was nearly illegible, and the accident report was thin on detail. Single vehicle collision, no surviving passengers. No mention of where the vehicle was stored, no photos, no witness statements. Margaret frowned. In 32 years of marriage, Thomas had been meticulous. Why did this paperwork feel hollow? She decided to go further. At the county records office, she requested copies of every public document connected to Thomas Ellis, marriage licenses, property deeds, tax filings. The clerk, a woman in her 30s with sharp glasses, flipped through the database. "There's a marriage record here," she said, tilting her head. "But it's not to you." Margaret's stomach dropped. "What's the date?" "June 2002. To a woman named Claire Benson. License issued in Florida." Margaret forced her voice to stay even. "Could you print that for me?" She left the office with a thin stack of papers in a manila folder, the edges damp from her sweaty grip. Sitting in her car, she flipped through them. There it was, in black ink. His name, his handwriting, even his familiar looping signature. And the date. It was during a week he'd claimed to be attending a work conference in Chicago. Her next stop was his old workplace, a regional supply company where he'd worked for over a decade. The receptionist remembered her and buzzed her through. She found Mike Turner, one of Thomas's former colleagues, now semi-retired. Mike greeted her with a warm but puzzled smile. "Margaret, it's been a long time. How are you holding up?" "I'm managing," she said. "Mike, I need to ask you something about Thomas. It's important." They sat in the break room over stale coffee. Margaret leaned in. Did Thomas ever mention having to travel unexpectedly? Places that didn't make sense? Mike hesitated. Thomas was a private man. Friendly, but careful with what he shared. "I do remember one thing, though. About a year before the accident, he took a sudden leave of absence. Said it was for family matters out west. When he came back, he didn't talk about it, and I didn't pry. Did you ever notice anything else?" Mike scratched his chin. "Once, I saw him without his wedding ring. When I joked about it, he said it was getting resized. But a week later, he was wearing a completely different band." Margaret absorbed this in silence, her mind slotting the pieces together into an image she didn't want to see. That night, she sat at her kitchen table with the papers spread out before her. The marriage license to Claire, the odd receipts from Louisiana, the incomplete accident report. She flipped through them like a deck of cards, each one a slap to her sense of reality. And then she noticed something she'd overlooked. In the margin of a bank statement was a handwritten note in Thomas's scrawl, an address in Columbia, South Carolina. She had never been there, never heard him mention it. Margaret stared at the address for a long time. She knew what it meant, a next step, a possible lead. Before bed, she called Helen. "I found something," she said without preamble. "So did I," Helen replied. "We're getting closer, Margaret. But the more you find, the worse it gets." Margaret hung up feeling both exhausted and electrified. The life she thought she had buried 5 years ago was unraveling thread by thread, and she couldn't stop pulling. In the quiet of her bedroom, she opened Thomas's flannel shirt from the cedar chest, the one she had clung to on the night of his funeral. She pressed it to her face, but this time the scent didn't comfort her. It felt like a lie she had been breathing in for decades. 2 weeks after she found the Columbia address scrawled in Thomas's handwriting, Margaret was sitting in her car in a quiet parking lot just outside Augusta, Georgia, gripping the steering wheel like it might keep her anchored. Across the street, a small diner glowed with the yellow warmth of old neon, the kind of place where strangers traded gossip over bottomless coffee. That's where she was supposed to meet Helen. The air smelled faintly of fried food and rain-soaked asphalt as she stepped inside. A bell over the door chimed. Her eyes swept the booths until they landed on a woman in her early 60s, hair silver blonde and neatly curled, wearing a navy cardigan. She looked up, and their eyes locked with a mix of recognition and wariness. 2 women who had never met, yet shared something far too intimate. Margaret slid into the booth. "Helen." Helen nodded, her expression measured. "Margaret, thank you for coming." The waitress brought 2 mugs of coffee without being asked, like she knew these women needed something strong. Margaret cut straight to it. "You said you had proof." Helen reached into a large leather tote and pulled out a folder. Inside were papers that looked hauntingly familiar. Marriage licenses, death certificates, photographs. She spread them on the table like a dealer laying down cards in a losing hand. Margaret's eyes landed first on a glossy photo, a younger Helen in a lace gown, smiling beside Thomas. He looked exactly as Margaret remembered him in the early years, tall, confident, that easy charm in his eyes. The date in the corner read June 17th, 1995. "This is our wedding day," Helen said, her voice steady. She tapped another document. His death certificate from 2008. "And this is when I buried him. Car accident. Closed casket." Margaret felt her throat tighten. 5 years later, I buried him too. Helen gave a mirthless smile. "You see the pattern." Margaret looked down at the next item, a photograph of Thomas, older, hair peppered with grey, standing on a sidewalk in Charleston, laughing with a woman she didn't recognize. The date stamp was from last year. "You took this?" Margaret asked. Helen shook her head. "A private investigator I hired did. I wanted closure. Instead, I got this." Margaret pushed the photo back toward her. "I found a marriage license to a woman in Florida, Claire Benson, dated 2002, while he was supposed to be at a work conference in Chicago." Helen's eyebrows lifted. "Claire's the one who told me there might be even more of us. She says she buried him in 2005. And then there's June in Texas. Claims he died of heart failure in 2019. She doesn't believe any of this yet." Margaret let out a slow breath. 4 wives. 4 funerals. Same man. Helen sipped her coffee, her eyes never leaving Margaret's. "And every time, there's an insurance payout. Not millions, but enough to start over somewhere new. I think he uses different names, keeps his stories just vague enough so no one can connect the dots." Margaret leaned back, feeling the booth's vinyl press cold against her shoulder blades. "You're telling me my marriage, the life I built, was just one chapter in his con?" Helen's voice softened. "I'm telling you he's not the man either of us thought he was. And if he's still alive, he's out there right now, doing it again to someone else." Margaret looked at the documents again, tracing the dates with her finger. Something about seeing his name in multiple handwriting styles, multiple official seals, made her skin crawl. She thought about the receipts from Baton Rouge, the bank statement with the Columbia address, the way his accident report had felt incomplete. "I need to see him," Margaret said suddenly. Helen studied her. "That's dangerous. If he realizes we're on to him. I don't care. I need to look him in the eye and hear him explain this." For a moment, Helen was silent. Then she slid a piece of paper across the table. On it was an address, Columbia, South Carolina. Margaret recognized it instantly as the one from the bank statement. "I think you'll find him here," Helen said. "But if you go, you won't be able to pretend you're just a grieving widow anymore. You'll know exactly what he is." Margaret folded the paper and slipped it into her purse. Her coffee had gone cold. She pushed the mug away. "I've been living in the dark for 5 years. I'm ready to see." Helen reached across the table and placed her hand over Margaret's. Her grip was firm, but there was no comfort in it, only solidarity. "Then we go together." They left the diner under a sky clearing from rain, the air sharp and clean. Margaret walked to her car with a folder under her arm, its weight unnatural, as if it carried not paper, but the fragments of a life she could no longer claim as her own. Driving home, she thought about the flannel shirt in her cedar chest, the smell she had held onto like a lifeline. 4 years, it had been a source of comfort. Now it was evidence. By the time she reached her driveway, Margaret had made up her mind. She wasn't just going to confront Thomas. She was going to confront the truth, no matter how ugly it was. And if Helen was right, That truth might still be breathing, laughing, and walking free just a few hours down the road. 2 days after the diner meeting, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with the blinds drawn, the glow from a single lamp casting long shadows across the folder Helen had given her. She had read and reread every page, every date, every signature until the ink seemed burned into her memory. But it wasn't enough. She needed more voices, more stories, to build the full picture of the man she thought she knew. Helen called just after 8 in the morning. "Claire's willing to talk to us," she said without preamble. "But she wants to meet in person. She's in Florida." Margaret didn't hesitate. "Tell me when." 2 days later, they were in a modest cafe in Jacksonville. Claire Benson arrived wearing oversized sunglasses despite the cloudy sky. She was in her late 50s, with sun-streaked hair pulled into a messy bun. The moment she slid into the booth across from them, she tossed a manila envelope onto the table like it was a weapon. "That's everything I've got," she said. "Marriage license, death certificate, photos from the funeral. I buried him in 2005 heart attack, they told me. Closed casket, of course." Margaret felt her jaw clench. "Same with me. Same with Helen." Claire gave a bitter laugh. "Guess he had a favorite trick." They spread the documents across the table. The signatures matched. The smile in the photographs matched. The cause of death was different, but the pattern was identical. A sudden tragedy, no body to view, and a life insurance payout within months. Helen leaned in. "Did he ever mention other family? Other women?" Claire shook her head. "No. He made me feel like I was his only tether in the world. But I did find something after he died, a receipt from a hotel in Texas. I thought it was just a business trip I didn't know about." Margaret and Helen exchanged a look. Texas. Later that week, they reached out to June, the woman from Texas Helen had mentioned before. June was reluctant at first. Her voice over the phone was defensive, clipped. "I don't know what kind of scam you're running, but my husband is dead," she said. "I buried him myself in 2019. Margaret took the phone. "June, I buried him in 2018. And Helen buried him in 2008. And Claire buried him in 2005. We all have papers to prove it. We just need you to see them." There was a long pause on the other end. Then June's voice, low and unsteady. "Send me what you've got." They met June in a quiet park in Dallas. She was younger than the rest, maybe mid-40s, with sharp eyes that darted around as if expecting someone to overhear. She sat on a bench, arms crossed, as Margaret handed her a stack of documents. June flipped through them slowly, her mouth tightening with each page. When she reached the photo of Thomas standing in Charleston, she froze. This is him. This is my husband." Claire leaned forward. "Our husband." June looked up, her face a mixture of disbelief and fury. "If he's alive, I swear," she broke off, pressing a hand to her forehead. "I thought I knew him. We were together 5 years. He said he'd never been married before." Helen's voice was calm but edged with steel. "He said that to all of us." The 4 women sat in heavy silence, broken only by the sound of children playing in the distance. It was surreal, this gathering of strangers bound by the same man's lies. Finally, Margaret spoke. "Every one of us thought we had a love story. Every one of us buried him. And every one of us got a payout afterward. This isn't just betrayal, it's fraud. It's criminal." June's jaw tightened. "So what do we do?" Helen leaned in. "We share everything we've got. Every receipt, every address, every photograph. And then we find him before he disappears again." Claire tapped the table. I still have that hotel receipt from Texas. Maybe we can trace it. See if he used a credit card or ID. Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out the scrap of paper with the Columbia address. I think this is where he is now. It matches an address from his bank statements. We can start there. They agreed to meet again in a week with whatever new information they could dig up. When they parted ways, there was no hugging, no tearful promises, only a silent pact. Driving back home, Margaret felt the strange stirrings of something she hadn't felt in years. Purpose. The grief that had kept her frozen for half a decade was shifting, transforming into something harder, sharper. She wasn't just a widow anymore. She was a hunter. 3 nights after the meeting in Dallas, Margaret was folding laundry in her quiet living room when her phone buzzed. The number was unfamiliar, with a New Mexico area code. She almost let it go to voicemail, but something made her swipe to answer. Mrs. Ellis? The voice was male, older, with a slow drawl. Yes. You don't know me, ma'am. Name's Frank Dillard. I used to work long haul with a fella I think might be your husband, or was. Saw your number listed in some old paperwork he left behind. Margaret's hands stilled. My husband died 5 years ago. There was a pause. Then Frank said, Well, ma'am, either I'm crazy, or I just had coffee with him last week in a diner outside Santa Fe. Her pulse thudded in her ears. What makes you so sure? Hard to forget a face I hauled freight with for 6 months. He's older now, hair's gone mostly grey, but same eyes, same laugh. Calls himself Tom Avery now. Lives out in a small town called Los Vargas, with a woman runs an antique store. Margaret gripped the phone tighter, every nerve sharp. Did he say anything about his past? Not much. Said he's been moving around a long time. Seemed jumpy when I asked too many questions. When she hung up, Margaret sat motionless, staring at the folded shirts in her lap. A part of her had prepared for this, for the possibility that Helen's photos were real, that Thomas was still breathing somewhere. But hearing it from a stranger, a man with no reason to lie, made it undeniable. She called Helen immediately. We've got him, she said, her voice low and steady. Helen didn't sound surprised. Where? New Mexico. A town called Los Vargas. He's using the name Tom Avery. Helen exhaled slowly. Then that's where we go. Before they hung up, Margaret asked, What do we do when we find him? Helen's answer was blunt. We make him look us in the eye. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table with a map spread out, tracing the route from Alabama to New Mexico with her finger. Memories collided with the present. The sound of his laugh, the way he'd kiss her on the forehead, the morning he left for his final business trip. Now she imagined confronting him in some dusty street, asking him why he'd buried her in grief while walking free under another name. Before bed, she opened the cedar chest at the foot of her bed and pulled out his flannel shirt. The scent had faded now, replaced by the must of wood and years gone by. She pressed it to her face anyway, and this time the fabric felt different, not a comfort but a challenge, a reminder that this wasn't over, and she wasn't the same woman who had stood by that closed casket 5 years ago. Somewhere in New Mexico, Thomas Ellis, or Tom Avery, was living a life built on lies. And for the first time in years, Margaret wasn't just surviving. She was moving toward something. The sun was beginning to dip when Margaret and Helen's rental car rolled into Los Vargas, New Mexico, a dusty speck of a town where the main street was lined with faded storefronts and the air carried the faint scent of mesquite smoke. The antique shop Frank had described sat on the corner, its front window cluttered with old clocks, porcelain figurines, and sun-bleached books. Margaret parked 2 blocks away. Her hands rested on the steering wheel long after she cut the engine. She could feel her heartbeat in her fingertips. Helen sat beside her, calm in appearance, but gripping her purse like it was holding something heavier than lipstick and keys. "You ready?" Helen asked quietly. "No," Margaret said, her voice steady. "But we're doing this anyway." They walked toward the shop, the crunch of gravel underfoot loud in the still air. Through the dusty glass, Margaret saw him, older, greyer, but unmistakably Thomas. He was laughing at something a woman behind the counter had said, leaning on the glass case like he belonged there. Margaret pushed the door open. The bell above it jingled, and Thomas looked up. For a split second, his expression was blank. Then the colour drained from his face. "Margaret," he said, her name escaping his lips like an old habit. Helen stepped forward, her tone sharp. "You remember me too, I'm sure." His eyes darted between them, calculating. "I think there's been some kind of mistake." Margaret cut him off. "Don't. Not one more lie. We know everything. Helen, Claire, June. All of us." The woman behind the counter glanced between them, frowning. "Tom, what's going on?" "Tom," Margaret repeated bitterly. "That's what you're calling yourself now? Tom Avery? How many names have you had, Thomas? How many lives?" He straightened, trying for the old confidence she used to mistake for strength. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," Margaret snapped. "You married us. You buried us. You cashed the checks and moved on, over and over." Helen's voice was lower, but sharper. "You didn't just take our money. You took our years, our trust. You made us mourn you while you were sipping coffee in another state." Thomas's jaw tightened. "I did what I had to do to survive." Margaret stared at him, disbelief mixing with fury. "Survive? You call this survival? Lying your way into people's lives, then vanishing when it suited you? Making women stand over empty graves?" The woman behind the counter had gone pale. "Tom, is this true?" Thomas didn't answer her. His gaze locked on Margaret, and for a moment she saw the man she'd once loved. The easy smile, the warmth in his eyes, but it was a ghost, a mask he wore when he wanted something. "You could have just left," Margaret said quietly. "If you were unhappy, you could have walked away. But you chose to kill yourself in our hearts instead." Helen reached into her purse and pulled out the folder of documents. She dropped it onto the counter, the papers spilling out, marriage licenses, death certificates, photographs from 4 different funerals. "This is who you are," she said. "Not Tom Avery. Not Thomas Ellis. Just a coward who runs." For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of an old wall clock. Thomas looked down at the papers, then back at them, his expression unreadable. "If you came here for an apology, you're wasting your time," he said finally. Margaret stepped closer, close enough to see the faint scar on his chin she used to kiss. "I didn't come for an apology. I came to make sure you know that we know. Your days of disappearing into another life are over." Helen's eyes narrowed. "We've got enough here to go to the authorities. Insurance fraud, falsified documents, maybe even more once they start digging." Thomas's bravado faltered. He glanced toward the back door, and Margaret could almost see the thought forming, run like he always did. But she moved first, planting herself between him and the exit. "Go ahead and try," she said. "You can't outrun the truth this time." The woman behind the counter finally spoke, her voice shaking. "Tom, I think you need to go." He looked at her, then back at Margaret and Helen. For the first time, his shoulders sagged. Without another word, He walked past them and out the door, the bell jangling in his wake. Margaret didn't watch him go. She stared at the empty space he left behind, feeling the weight of years lift, not all at once, but enough to take a full breath. Helen rested a hand on her arm. "It's not over," she said. "No," Margaret agreed, her voice steady. "But it's ending." Outside, the desert sun was sinking, painting the sky in streaks of gold and crimson. For the first time in 5 years, Margaret felt the horizon ahead of her was open, not because she had forgiven, but because she had faced the man who thought he could bury her alive in grief. And she had walked away standing. The drive back from Los Varros was silent, the hum of the highway the only sound between Margaret and Helen. The desert stretched endlessly on either side, the horizon fading into a dusky lavender. Margaret kept her eyes on the road, but her mind was still in that antique shop, replaying the way Thomas's face had drained of colour when he saw them. She had thought confronting him would bring a rush of satisfaction, a sense of justice. Instead, there was only a strange, heavy stillness inside her, like the moment after a storm when the air is thick with the scent of rain but the ground is still littered with debris. Helen finally spoke. "We could take this to the police tomorrow. We have enough." Margaret tightened her grip on the steering wheel. "I know." She glanced at Helen. "But once we do, it's not just his life that gets torn apart. That woman in the shop, she didn't know who he really was. There might be others, and all of them will have to live with what we tell them." Helen was quiet for a moment, then said, "You're not thinking of letting him walk away, are you?" Margaret shook her head. "No. I'm thinking about what happens when the truth explodes. It'll destroy everything in its path." They drove on, the road unwinding before them like a choice neither had made yet. By the time Margaret reached her driveway that night, the air in Alabama was heavy with summer humidity. She stood in her living room, looking at the photographs on the mantel, her and Thomas smiling on their wedding day, his arm around her shoulders, their eyes bright with promises that now felt like shadows. She picked up one frame and held it for a long time, her reflection overlapping with the frozen image of the man she thought she knew. In the quiet, she realized something. Exposing him wouldn't erase the years she'd lost. It wouldn't give her back the mornings she'd woken up alone, the nights she'd cried herself to sleep. But maybe it would give someone else a warning before they fell for that same warm smile and easy charm. Margaret set the frame back down and exhaled. Tomorrow, she and Helen would decide how to move forward, whether to take their evidence to the authorities, or to track down the other women and arm them with the truth. For now, she stepped out onto her porch. The cicadas hummed in the dark, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the warm night air settle over her. She didn't know exactly what justice would look like yet, but she knew one thing. She was no longer the woman who had stood at a closed casket, believing every word she was told. Somewhere out there, Thomas Ellis, or whatever name he chose next, was looking over his shoulder, and for the first time, Margaret liked the thought of being the shadow he couldn't shake.